Hi guys, thanks for tuning in, and in this video I'm gonna compare the Canon EOS R5 against the Canon EOS R6. I had some weeks to play with both cameras, and the big question is it really worth it to upgrade or to buy the EOS R5 instead of the EOS R6? Because on paper they almost do the same, almost. And yeah, we're gonna find out if the Canon EOS R5 is really worth it or not. Coming up. Hi guys, my name is Paul, I'm a German filmmaker, and this channel is all about filmmaking, gear reviews, but also DaVinci Resolve tutorials. So if that's something that you're interested in, consider subscribe, I would really appreciate that. Thank you. So short disclaimer, Canon did send me the EOS R5 for a couple of weeks for testing. The Canon EOS R6 is my own personal camera. However, Canon didn't pay me to say anything. My opinion is totally unbiased, and yeah. So I personally bought the Canon EOS R6 because the Canon EOS R6 is gonna be my B camera anyway, so most of the features, for example as 8K or something like that, is overkill personally for me. So what the Canon EOS R6 does was totally okay for me. So yeah. But from the physical standpoint, both cameras are almost identical. From the grip, they both feel really great in the hand, I would say. The only thing that I do prefer of the Canon EOS R6 is that you have this dial here for changing video and photo mode. And on the R6 you don't have that. It's much like on the R. And yeah, that's just a personal thing, but I do prefer how it's made here in the Canon EOS R6. By the way, I'm not talking here about any photography features because I'm a filmmaker and I want to focus only on that. Talking about the cards that both cameras use, here we have two SD card slots on the R6, and here we have an SD card slot and a CF Express card. So you might think, hey, it's great, we finally have dual card slots for proxy recording or backup recording. No, unfortunately, if you're a filmmaker, that does not work. And that already leads me to the file performance, so computer performance, and both do have, if you are recording in 10-bit, an H.265 compression, which does make smaller file sizes, but they are really hard to edit. I have an iMac 2019 maxed out, and 4K is not editable for me. I have to create proxies. Full HD is working, but if you're working on a bigger project, as I did, yeah, it's not really the greatest workflow. So I would have really preferred that Canon would change something about the compression algorithm, because I have already worked with other cameras that used H.265 compression, for example Zcam, and that played back very smoothly on my computer. So editing these files is not really great, so that's something that you have to keep in mind. So now let's talk. Both cameras have IBIS, so they both have a stabilized sensor, which is really great. And I can honestly say that there's no difference between them. That works perfectly well on the EOS R6 as well as on the EOS R5. So if you have a lens that's stabilized, it looks really great. You see it right here, the 24p footage. It's really held smooth, and also for the shooting that I did last week, where I used both cameras, that became very handy for handheld shooting, so I didn't needed to stabilize anything, so that was perfectly smooth all the time. However, I also used the Sigma 24-35, which is the equivalent for full frame as the 18-35, and this lens hasn't any stabilization at all. And if I have sensor stabilization turned on, it really ruins my footage, because it does some really ugly movement, something, so it doesn't really work at all. So I don't know what kind is not working, if it's the fault of the camera or the fault of the lens, or why they don't communicate to each other. But yeah, it's not working. So it's better to turn sensor stabilization completely off, and then it's more stable just using your hands as you would back in the days before IBIS and something like that. So let's talk about rolling shutter. I used the 1DX Mark II before, and that had a horrible rolling shutter. So I'm really surprised that Canon really improved that. The rolling shutter that you have on either of these cameras is identical, and it's really minimal, so really good rolling shutter performance. It's really way better than on my Blackmagic Pocket, which I'm filming on right now. So if you're concerned about that, rolling shutter shouldn't be an issue on both of these cameras. So let's talk about autofocus performance. That's also really important, and I've tested both of these cameras with an Canon RF lens, which is the 24-105, and the Tamron EF 24-70 2.8, and yeah, there was no difference at all. Both cameras performed the same. They do perform really well with EF lenses and even with third-party EF lenses, as well as with the RF lenses. It's ever so slightly better when you use an RF lens than, for example, a third-party EF lens. But it's really usable also in a professional environment. I use that all the time on the R6. So I'm really glad that there's no difference and that Canon did not cripple the R6 over the R5, either in sensor stabilization, also in autofocus. So that's really great on both cameras. So now let's come to a quick conclusion before we're gonna start to talk about image quality. So already we see that both of these cameras are truly identical, also in autofocus and IBIS, and Canon didn't cripple the R6 because the R5 is the flagship camera. So yeah, I think that's really great, but the image quality is way more important, right? So as I've tested the EOS R6 and I was watching YouTube videos, I saw a lot of complaints that this camera is too yellowish. So I was really curious how both of these cameras would match up. So I've tested that with the same lens, same lighting, same settings, all that kind of stuff. And I did notice that both cameras look a little bit different, but there was not a huge difference. But if you want to shoot on both cameras simultaneously, as I did for my last project, I would recommend you to change something in the white balance. So I set the R6 to 1 point more blue and 1 point more magenta, so B1, M1. And on the R5 I did the same on blue, so blue 1 and green 1. So the R5 came in just too more magenta-ish, whereas the R6 came in a little bit more too green. So therefore I added magenta here and green here, and both of them came in a little bit too warm, so I add blue to both, and then you have a perfect neutral image that you can work on. Skin tones, however, are always perfect on both cameras. So let's finally compare sharpness and overall image quality on these cameras. And here it's really a difference in terms of recording modes, because the Canon EOS R5 can record up to 8K and the Canon EOS R6 can only record up to 4K. However, I also was curious how good is the Full HD, because I've owned the EOS R before, and I was pleasantly surprised when I got the R6 that the Full HD did improve quite a bit. And Full HD on both cameras is totally identical and both look great. And I also did my last project only in Full HD because the detail is so great in the Full HD that I don't personally need 4K that much, but anyways, it's good. It's quite good to have it when you need it. But then I also compared, because the Canon EOS R5 has two 4K modes. It has the 4K HQ mode, which you might know. Then the camera downsamples the 8K sensor, which is the max resolution, to 4K, and you have a very sharp 4K image. The Canon EOS R6 always do that when shooting in 4K, because it has a 5.5K sensor and it downsampled it for you to 4K from 5.5K. But I was really curious to know how good is the 4K non-HQ, because here the EOS R5 uses like line skipping, pixel binning, so not the highest quality. And I compared it to the Full HD of the EOS R6, and I was pleasantly surprised that there was not a big difference at all. So yeah, you can actually shoot in Full HD easily, and there's not a big difference, not a huge noticeable difference, I would say. So always, if your only concern is 4K or 4K 60 whatsoever, I would really stick to the R6, because on the EOS R5 it also uses this line skipped mode in 4K 60, which the EOS R6 doesn't. Because if we look side by side, the 4K 60, you see there's way more detail in the EOS R6 than in the EOS R5. So if 4K 60 is the only thing that counts to you, I would really suggest you going with the R6 instead of the R5. And also, sure, if you shoot 24p, the normal 4K mode compared to the non-HQ mode on the EOS R5, the Canon EOS R6 is better, because it always super samples it from the 5.5K sensor. Then we are coming to the 4K HQ mode compared to the 4K on the Canon EOS R6, and that the camera only can do 4K HQ up to 30p, so no 60p. And the 4K HQ out of this camera looks amazing. It blows away the 4K of this camera, which is already pretty good. But this 4K is on a whole new level. Really, I've never seen an image detailed as this. It's really crazy, and it's totally identical to the 8K image if you shoot that. So the only advantage for shooting really in 8K is if you really are planning to zoom in and post a lot. But if you're not doing it, the 4K HQ on the EOS R5 looks really amazing. So yeah, that's really mind-blowing, so to say. So if you want the best 4K image possible, go with the R5. It's better than the R6, but if you also want to do super sharp 4K 60, then go with the R6, so to say. Then let's finally talk about super slow motion. So the Canon EOS R5 can do 4K 120, whereas the EOS R6 can only do Full HD 120p. Fortunately, both cameras have full autofocus performance, so that works really well on both of these cameras, and both also do 10-bit C-Log 422. And yeah, I think from the image quality standpoint, so there was not that real advantage in clarity or in detail in the 4K 120. The 4K 120 looks good on the R5. The only advantage that I'm seeing is that the R6 has a whole lot of noise when shooting in 120p, so it's not as detailed as, for example, the Full HD in 24p. And the EOS R5 doesn't have that much noise, so it's way more controlled over here. But as I've already said, there's not a huge step up in terms of detail in the image, and that already leads me to my previous consumption or decision that the Full HD looks almost identical to the line skipped 4K mode on the R5, and because it's also using the same algorithm when shooting 4K 120, it's the same right there. The only thing is that it has a whole lot more noise in 120p. So yeah, okay, if you want to shoot, or if you often want to shoot in 4K 120, then or go with the R5 obviously, but there's not a huge step up in terms of image clarity or image details, just the amount of noise. It's way more controlled on the R5. So now let's talk about the low light performance from both of these cameras. I was really curious how that is, because I was really curious because the Canon EOS R5 has a 45 megapixel sensor, and normally the higher the megapixel count, the more or the worse is the ISO performance. And I was really pleasantly surprised when I did the Canon EOS R6 review that the low light performance is amazing. And yeah, the EOS R5 is more noisy than the EOS R6, of course, but it's only one stop difference. I think the EOS R5 is usable up to ISO 12800, whereas the EOS R6 is usable up to 25600, which is insane, I think. But for me personally, I want to have a full frame sensor that is good in ISO 6400, and both cameras do that perfectly. So if you're shooting a whole lot more in low light situation and you want to have the best low light performance in a Canon ecosystem, then the EOS R6 is the way to go. But already ISO 12800 looks also pretty good on the EOS R5. So now let's come to the final conclusion. Should you buy the Canon EOS R5 over the EOS R6? And my personal opinion is no, because the EOS R6 has almost everything what many content creators ask for. It has a full frame 4K super sharp image. It has 10-bit 422 C-Log, so also log image that you can use. Yeah, it has great colors, great autofocus. It has IBIS. So the only advantage that you have here is the 8K sensor, and you can shoot 8K RAW, which enables the camera to have like C-Log 2, which has the most dynamic range. C-Log normally is a little bit limited when it comes to that, but Canon already stated that they will add Canon C-Log 3, which is kind of the middle dynamic range thing, will add that to both of these cameras. So yeah, that will even improve the dynamic range, which is quite decent. It's not as good as, for example, the Blackmagic Pocket or a proper cinema camera, but we are talking here about a mirrorless camera, not a professional movie camera, right? So I think the dynamic range on both of these cameras is quite good. However, I personally don't see any usage in the 8K RAW. The file sizes are massive. When I mean massive, they are heavy to edit, almost non-editable, and also the file sizes are huge also compared to the Blackmagic Pocket with 6K RAW. It's, yeah, so I wouldn't really use that, at least in a special occasion. And for most of the shooting scenarios which I find myself into, and I think most of you are as well, the Canon EOS R6 gets the job done at 100% with a very great image quality. So the only thing that you have to ask yourself is the 8K really worth it? Because the 4K 120, for me it's not, because I don't use that often. If you use only 120p, okay, then maybe sure. But also the 4K 60 looks better on here. And yeah, I think there's not much to say about it. I think the Canon EOS R6 is the better choice. The only question is if you want to need 8K or RAW recording, 8K RAW recording, then you can definitely do that on the R5, but for most of the other situation, the R6 is perfectly. So you know the game. If you have any more questions, then just drop them down in the comments below. And I'm gonna see you in my very next video, which will be the Komodo versus the Blackmagic Pocket, so stay tuned for that. Cheers!